Let me give you an example about oil markets, which is the area I know most about. One of the interesting developments in recent years has been an increased fragmentation of the oil market. So we used to think a barrel of oil is a barrel of oil, pretty much no matter where. That was never really literally true, but a pretty good approximation. Now recently what has happened is that we see increased imbalances for different types of crude oil. So crude oil can be classified by its density, whether it's light or heavy, and by its sulfur content, whether it's sweet or sour. And so what has been happening in the US, for example, as you may have heard of, was that the price of West Texas Intermediate, which is a relatively light and sweet crude oil, actually dropped relative to the price of Brent, which was very unusual. Now, why was that? Well, essentially, the main trading market in the US is in Cushing, Oklahoma. And in Cushing, Oklahoma, there was too much oil of that particular type accumulating. There was no way of getting it to refiners to be processed, and so the price started falling. So what we see increasingly is that at the same time you might have a glut of a certain type of crude oil and abundant crude oil of another type, or maybe a scarcity in a different market. So from the point of view of someone looking at the oil market, it means you have to think about matching up different types of crude oil with different refineries, where each refinery is set up to process a certain type of crude oil. And if you want to understand the dynamics in the market overall, you have to know about the transportation infrastructure, how easy it is to get the oil to a particular refinery, what the spare capacity is, etc., etc. So in a way, things are getting a lot more complicated than they used to be, but also interesting. Yes, so as far as oil markets are concerned, there are mainly two questions I've worked on. One is, what is driving oil prices? The second question is, when oil prices move, how is this affecting the economy? And the paper I'm presenting at the conference is very much about the second question. It's about the pass-through from oil price shocks to food prices. Now, when we're talking about food prices here, it's important to be careful to distinguish between prices of agricultural food commodities traded in exchange markets, on the one hand, and the price you pay for food if you go to the supermarket, that is the retail price for food. The reason that's important is that you can see big movements in agricultural crop prices without seeing corresponding big movements in retail food prices. So let me give you an example. Suppose you go to the supermarket and you buy bread. Now, the price you pay for that bread depends, of course, on the price of wheat, because bread usually is being produced from wheat. But actually, the cost share of wheat in bread is only about 5%. So what that means is, if the price of wheat goes up 100%, then, because of the cost share of 5%, the price of bread is only going to move by 5%. Right? And so you can see big fluctuations in crop prices without big fluctuations in retail food prices. And very often when people talk about the rising food prices in the world, they're kind of mixing up these concepts, and that can get confusing. Now, how would an oil price shock be transmitted to retail food prices? Well, there are basically two channels. One channel is through affecting the cost of food marketing. Now, food marketing is all those things that happen to turn wheat into bread in the supermarket. So it's about refining, about storing, about distributing. And if you're thinking, for example, of trucks driving bread to different supermarkets, you might think that there should be a link. If the price of oil goes up and the price of diesel fuel goes up, that this will be reflected ultimately in food prices. And there's a lot of concern about that. Now, what we did is we looked at different stages of the production of meat and dairy products and many other foods. And across the board, we found no evidence that oil price shock raised the cost of food marketing. So that's not an important channel. Now, the other way you can get food prices to go up in the supermarket is through rising crop prices. And there are two ways that could happen. What most people are thinking of is a cost-push argument. The idea is, if you have a farmer and the farmer is using a tractor, well, that tractor uses diesel fuel, so if the oil price goes up, that means it's going to get more expensive to produce crops, and so crop prices rise and therefore food prices. The problem with that argument is that the share of expenditures on energy in farming, like in the whole economy, is quite low. And so you have the same problem that you can have pretty big movements in oil prices and little movement in the cost of farming. The second story is what I would call a demand pull story. That is, the reason why crop prices go up is because there is more demand. Now, how do we know whether that is going on? Well, one way of thinking about that is to look at the price of nitrogen fertilizer. What's interesting about nitrogen fertilizer is that it is being made from natural gas, not from oil. Now, in the US, because of the shale gas revolution, the price of natural gas dropped a lot, while the price of oil went up. So you know that there cannot have been cost push effects from higher oil prices in fertilizer prices, because they depend on the natural gas price, which actually fell. Nevertheless, when you look at the response of fertilizer prices to an oil price shock, on average, over the period since about 2006, it's been going up. And the only way for that to happen is for demand for oil and agricultural commodities to have shifted at the same time. Now, what would shift that demand? Well, there are many stories. One story is simply that the world economy is growing. People in countries like China are getting richer, and that's going to affect food consumption patterns, and as a result, it's going to affect food prices. And you can quantify that effect, and it's somewhere between 15% and 30% perhaps. If you look at the residual price movements in soybeans, wheat, rice, and other commodities, the picture actually is not the same across commodities. That is, there are no big patterns where you say, oh, one phenomenon explains movements in all of these prices at the same time. For example, there is no evidence for something like speculation, because if speculation were driving these prices, they all should have gone up at about the same time, but they didn't. And in fact, when you look across commodities, you see some big increases in the price of rice. But actually, rice is not competing with any of the commodities that are usually associated with biofuel policies, like corn, for example, that is used to produce ethanol, because rice is grown essentially on wetlands, lands that you cannot use to grow anything else like wheat or soybeans or corn. And nevertheless, we see big price increases in rice as well. And so that's telling you that there are many different stories, but there is not one simple story that explains everything. Now, going back now to the question of what do you pay in the supermarket, well, what that is telling you is that if you live in an industrialized economy, there's no reason to worry, because food prices in industrialized economies in recent years really have not gone up a whole lot compared to other prices. This is a little bit different when you're talking about developing countries. And the difference is that if you live in a developing country, then you don't eat as much processed foods, right? The foods you eat are much closer to the original raw foods that are being produced by farmers. And you spend a lot more of your income on food. So if the price of food goes up, that has a much bigger effect on your life. And so you would think that these effects could be much bigger in developing countries, and there's a lot of concern about that. We don't know very much about that, however, because we don't have good data on what people pay for staple foods in developing countries. And so what people have done is either to take survey data, but survey data, for example, collected by the World Bank is only for certain locations, it's not for long time spans, and it's kind of hard to understand changes over time, over several years using these data. Or people have simply equated agricultural commodity prices with the price of food people pay in those countries, and that's not quite right either, because for one thing, the exchange rate may move a lot in some of these countries, and so the actual increase in the price of staple foods might be much bigger or much smaller. But there are also concerns that what this means for developing countries depends on their trade and agricultural policies. For example, it has been shown that a country like Vietnam actually benefited from higher global agricultural commodity prices because they have a fairly egalitarian distribution of land, lots of people work in agriculture, and so they're actually benefiting from that because they're earning income by producing food. But if you go to a country like Pakistan, on the other hand, where agricultural policies in general have been tilted to benefit the urban poor, well, if their subsidized food now is more expensive, that's of course a bad thing from the point of view of analyzing poverty. So, and then the last point I want to mention here, and that is that the policies, protectionist policies enacted by many developing countries, according to research done at the World Bank, for example, have also contributed to rising food prices. That is, when food prices started going up, many countries responded by not exporting food anymore, which then in turn increased food prices. And so to some extent, it's very hard to disentangle what the effects are, how much of that is really coming from ultimately oil price shocks or other factors like the biofuel revolution, and how much of it is domestic.